But for now, let's turn to the economy and pay rises for public sector workers. New data from the ABS has shown that public sector wages have grown 3.9% in the year to June. That's up from 3.1% a year earlier. Now, this 0.9% growth is the highest June quarter rise in 12 years. That's a good thing if you're a worker receiving a pay rise, but for the rest of the country, these public sector pay rises are inflationary and they risk pushing up rates even higher. Albanese gave childcare workers a 15% pay rise just days after RBA Governor Michelle Bullock warned government spending was inflationary. And now unions representing aged care workers and disability carers are set to demand pay rises too. And who could blame them? They do deserve a pay rise. But the issue is that Michelle Bullock has specifically said that even modest wage gains, and 15% isn't modest, but even modest wage gains of 3.5% would prove inflationary if productivity growth didn't improve. The fact that there's strong wage growth without productivity growth is risky and it's keeping inflation persistent. Well, to further discuss this, let's bring in tonight's political panel, Labor MP and Chair of the Australian Labor Party Economics Committee, Andrew Charlton, and Nationals Leader in the Senate, Bridget McKenzie. Great to see you both back again. Andrew, you're famously an economist. Do you agree with the RBA that pay rises in the public sector are inflationary when productivity is as weak as it is at the moment?
Well, good to be with you, Sharri. And you're right, we did get wages data out this week, and that wages data showed that real wages have grown in Australia for the last 3 consecutive quarters. And that's in contrast to the last 10 years when Australian wages flatlined. There was no real wages growth for 10 years. So I think it's a good thing that wages are moving in the right direction. Now, specifically on the types of workers that you've been talking about and their impact on inflation, I'd say a couple of things. First of all, I'd say that most Australians would look at those workers and agree that they have been underpaid for a long time. And most Australians would also see that if we don't lift wages in those sectors, we're going to have a workforce crisis in critical areas. Areas like aged care, looking after elderly Australians, and childcare, educating the next generation of Australians. But your point is right. If we want these wage rises to be sustainable, which we do, we have to make sure they are backed by productivity gains. And that's why the government is so focused on lifting the rate of productivity growth up from the record low that the Liberals left it at.
Bridget, are you confident that the government is doing enough, as Andrew just said, to lift productivity and enough to mean that these 15% pay rises that could be replicated in other sectors, that they won't be inflationary?
No, I'm not, Sharri. There's no surprise in that. And I'm not the only one that lacks confidence in the federal government. It seems the Reserve Bank Governor does as well. The reality is she was very, very clear that state and federal governments, Labor governments, are not only increasing the pay rate of public servants, they're also increasing the headcount, which is actually leading to significant issues and keeping inflation higher for longer than it actually needs to be. Economists are very, very concerned about the spending profile of state and federal Labor governments and the heated nature that that's having in our economy more broadly. So Andrew talks a big game on productivity. It starts with a zero. It has the entire time they've been in government. And when you've got productivity dampening policies, such as the industrial relations policies that they've been bringing in, such as cuts to funding critical road and rail infrastructure projects that would increase the productivity, particularly of our supply chains across the country. They're pulling all the wrong levers, and that is why Australians are having to have interest rates higher than they need to be for longer than they need to be and longer than they are being in comparable countries around the world.
Look, let's have a look at the levels of immigration. The Daily Telegraph today reporting a massive 1.15 million migrants have arrived under the Albanese government. That's 62% more migrants than during the Rudd-Gillard-Rudd era, when it was also quite high. Now, Andrew, the government has argued publicly that it does intend to cut the migration program. But do you think that this now could be delayed or should be delayed? And do you think migration might be kept high so as to keep Australia out of a recession?
Well, Sharri, you're right that migration numbers have been high. And in particular, they've been high in comparison to the record lows during COVID. There was a big bounce back from those record lows once international borders reopened and once students started to come back to Australia from other countries. What the government has now done is to make sure that we manage the overall rate of migration. We are in the process of halving the net migration to Australia from its peak by the end of this financial year. And we're doing that through responsible actions to close some of the loopholes that the previous government left in the post-COVID era by making sure that we bring integrity back to our international education system and by reforming the migration system to make sure it best suits the needs of Australia and the skills gaps that we have in this country. So I think we're getting the migration numbers down by half and doing it in a way that will deliver lots of positive benefits to Australia over the longer term.
Bridget, the issue is the migration levels are putting more pressure on housing, no doubt about it. But without the high migration, we'd be in recession right now. So do you think, given the economy is still teetering and we're still walking that narrow path to avoid going into recession, do you think actually perhaps the government does need to keep migration levels high for at least the next 12 months?
No, I don't, Sharri. I think if they actually did other things, like got their spending under control and focused on productivity enhancing measures rather than politically enhancing economic measures, you'd see a different economic profile right now. The reality is we've got record migration because the Labor Party has approved a record number of visas since coming to government. That's it, full stop. And if you are in our suburbs or congested regional capitals, you cannot afford a house if you're in the market, and you can't find a house to actually rent. And that is the reality. And anybody who sat in the car park that are our main road arterials at peak hour knows that we need to put a brake on migration. And I'm really tired of hearing the talking points and yet again seeing no action from the ministers responsible on behalf of the Australian people to get this under control.
Yeah, it's a huge problem. The rental crisis as well. We're seeing average families becoming homeless as well. Now, this is a bit of a controversial idea from Government Services Minister Bill Shorten. He's announced, a thought bubble perhaps, that Labor is developing a digital ID program. It's known as the Trust Exchange, or TEX for short. Here he was speaking about it yesterday.
TEX is something brand new and world-leading. It is not a wallet, nor an app, nor ID, but rather it is a secure means by which to exchange with a third party who you are, your identity, and what you can do, your credentials.
Andrew, why do Australians need a digital ID?
Well, Australians should have the choice to have a digital ID because it will significantly increase their security online. What we have at the moment is a system where if you want to prove your identity to any service provider, a healthcare provider, a bank, another utility, you are required to provide them with ID documentation, your passport, your licence, and those documents are then stored by those institutions and have been the subject of cyber hacks. And that means that millions of Australians are losing valuable information, which can then put them at risk. So what Bill Shorten is talking about is providing people with an option where instead of providing those documents and putting themselves at risk that those documents could fall into the hands of cyber criminals, there'll be an alternative method for them to prove their identity, which doesn't expose them to those same risks. I think it's important for Australians to have choice. But this is a choice that many Australians, I think, will find attractive because it will reduce their risk of identity theft and reduce their risk of cybercrime.
Bridget, there are concerns about government holding such sensitive data, given government cybersecurity is not known to be a strong point. Do you think this is a good idea, and would you trust the government rather than the private sector to develop technology like this?
Sharri, I'm a Conservative. I don't trust the government over private citizens at all. But I think governments have shown to have data breaches regularly. I'm a law-abiding firearm owner, and there's been numerous state governments where suddenly everyone that owns a firearm in that state's been released publicly for public disclosure where they live and where the firearm is. I mean, that is a public safety issue, not just a personal integrity issue. So I would have significant concerns. I think the Labor Party, the last time they tried something like an Australia card, didn't go down well. So I would be wanting to see a lot more detail from Bill Shorten and the Labor Party before I'm subscribing to a digital version of an Australia card.
Yeah, I think there is
not a digital version of an Australia card.
I just want to see the detail, Andrew.
This is a very, very different thing.
How is it different?
21st century thing.
How is it different?
Well, this is a way for people to avoid precisely the problem that Bridget is talking about. Rather than having to give over your sensitive documents in order to prove your identity when you sign up to a new service, this is an alternative that people can choose to be able to prove their identity without doing that.
And until some bright young spark in a country far away works out how to hack it.
Well, bright young sparks in countries far away are hacking our private sector systems every single day, and we've seen that in Optus, in Medibank, in Medisecure, on and on.
So it doesn't sound like a great idea to me, Andrew.
And what this is doing is making us safer from precisely those things, because instead of Optus having to store your licence and your passport, you won't have to provide those documents to Optus. So Bridget needs to read this legislation, understand what it's doing, and appreciate that what it's doing is actually meaning that you'll have to give over fewer documents, and that will increase your cybersecurity and reduce your risk.
Andrew, I think if she managed to read your thick economics textbook, I think she can get a handle on this legislation, and we can talk about it next Wednesday. Next Wednesday on the show. All right, good to see you both, Bridget McKenzie, Andrew Charlton. Thank you.